Hi everybody, it's Meredith. So here we are nearing the end of September, and October 22nd, when Mosaic is supposed to go live, is rapidly approaching. So I have a couple thoughts on it that I wanted to share with you. Ever since Sport Pilot 1.0 was launched in 2004, I've wondered why the FAA has continued to require private pilots to maintain a third-class medical when sport pilots could fly with only a driver's license.
To wrestle with this question, it's important to have a basic understanding of the Mosaic rule and the FAA requirements for obtaining a third-class medical certificate or a student, sport, or private pilot certificate. On July 22nd, the FAA announced its final approval of Mosaic, a 700-plus page rule that includes sweeping changes for the general aviation industry. The most significant change for pilots is the expansion of sport pilot privileges to include the ability to act as pilot in command of four-seat aircraft, including legacy models like the Cessna 172. Sport pilots will now be able to fly many of the same aircraft flown by private pilots. They will be able to do virtually everything that private pilots can do, all without having to prove their physical and mental fitness to the FAA. So why then does the FAA still require some level of medical certification for private pilots? Let's dig into it. If you're still fuzzy on any of this, you might want to pause the video here and catch up. But if you're ready, buckle up because we're about to plunge headfirst down into the rabbit hole.
The reality of light sport aircraft is because they're so light, they can be very challenging to handle in wind, even for experienced pilots. This is likely one of the reasons why general aviation industry groups and the FAA collaborated to develop Mosaic. This new rule allows sport pilots to fly conventional two-seat aircraft like my Cessna 150 and even many four-seat aircraft like my Cessna 172, when previously under Sport Pilot 1.0, sport pilots were limited to flying only two-seat light sport aircraft, which by definition had a maximum gross weight of 1,320 pounds.
I highly recommend watching this video produced by Paul Bertorelli of AvWeb. He explains light sport aircraft better than anyone else I know.
This new freedom for sport pilots sounds great in theory, but as with any big government regulation, there are more than a few gotchas to consider, and I'd like to go over those with you now.
I'll put a link in the description to this video which I published about a month ago, which outlines, in my opinion, the ambiguities in the current rulemaking and proposed regulation changes that make it quite difficult for instructors like me to actually implement Sport Pilot 2.0.
So my big question about the new Mosaic rule is this. Does the FAA have sufficient data to justify continuing to require a third-class medical certificate for private pilots and student pilots who are seeking a private pilot certificate, when under Mosaic, sport pilots and student pilots seeking a sport pilot certificate in similar aircraft do not need an FAA medical certificate, only a driver's license? This big question has precipitated other questions, including, has the FAA conducted any studies to compare the fatal accident rate for sport pilots operating without an FAA medical certificate with pilots who do hold a third-class medical? Does the NTSB specifically track pilot medical incapacitation as a probable cause?
The NTSB does indeed appear to track medical incapacitation as a probable cause of aircraft accidents, quite specifically actually. If you click this link on their website, you can view the codes used by investigators to classify various elements of an accident report. There are hundreds of these codes, apparently stored in a mainframe computer somewhere. Note that this coding document has not been updated in nearly 30 years. I attempted to download and view the raw data, hoping I could import it into my spreadsheet software and search for the codes. But my fairly robust home PC was unable to do this. It nearly crashed the computer. Instead, I attempted to use the Carroll search page to search for aircraft accidents where medical incapacitation was noted as a probable cause, but there is no direct way to do this on this website. The only way I could search for medical incapacitation as a probable cause in general aviation accidents was to use the Carroll tool and type relevant keywords into the search box. Note that Carroll says this searches the synopsis and the full narrative of NTSB reports, not the probable cause, so that's the best I could do. So using this method, I searched for all general aviation accidents in the United States since January of 2004, which was the year Sport Pilot 1.0 was launched. This produced about 28,000 results. A text search for the word incapacitation produced 331 results, or about 1% of the total. I read through the probable cause of each one of those and discovered that only about 80 had some medical causal factor cited in the probable cause. The most common factors included cardiac arrest, carbon monoxide poisoning, hypoxia, and over-the-counter or illegal medications. The rest included phrases such as an in-flight loss of control for undetermined reasons. I searched the database for other terms that could potentially indicate pilot incapacitation and produced the following results. The thing is, though, stuff like carbon monoxide poisoning and hypoxia could never be predicted through a medical evaluation, a third class, second class, or even a first class. These types of things are usually the result of poor pilot choice or some mechanical problem, having nothing to do with medical certification. But the real question is, what portion of these events involved pilots who were flying without medicals? Again, it's very difficult to determine because there isn't a clear way to search the NTSB reports based on the pilot certificate and/or medical certificate held by the pilot in command.
What was the FAA's argument for supporting the expansion of sport pilot privileges in the final Mosaic rule?
If you look at the executive summary, the FAA says, quote, "This rule aims to increase the availability of safe, modern, and affordable aircraft for recreational aviation, flight training, and certain aerial work."
How does the FAA define its safety continuum for pilots in the Mosaic final rule?
In the final rule, the FAA states that, quote, "The safety continuum is a concept that the FAA has used for years. Per the safety continuum concept, FAA bases the rigor of certification requirements on the potential risk to the public for an aircraft operation."
How does the FAA define risk to the public imposed by general aviation in the Mosaic final rule?
In responding to public comments, presumably including the one that I submitted, the FAA stated, quote, "For pilot certification, FAA compared training requirements commensurate to the certificate, privileges, and limitations among sport, recreational, and private pilots. Per the safety continuum concept, the exposure of the public to risk should correspond with the rigor of the related certificate." I think we can all agree that there is a clear, quantifiable difference in, quote, "risk to the public" between air carrier and general aviation operations. An airliner can carry hundreds of passengers, whereas a piston single or light twin can carry only a few. So it seems illogical to use the safety continuum concept to segregate general aviation operations based purely on medical certification criteria, when there are other, more relevant factors to consider.
So here's the big question. Why was it ever necessary, and why is it still necessary to have a third-class medical as a private pilot to fly this or this with private pilot privileges, but it's not necessary to have a medical, and you can just use your driver's license to fly this or this as a sport pilot? Under Mosaic now, why is it necessary for a private pilot exercising private pilot privileges to need a third-class medical to fly this or this, but a sport pilot exercising sport pilot privileges or a private pilot exercising sport pilot privileges does not need a medical to fly this or this? Do you think the airplane cares? I don't think the airplane cares.
I'm sure some of you are out there saying, well, what about BasicMed? Yes, this is an alternative solution for private pilots who don't want to get a third-class medical, but it still requires paperwork and a visit to a doctor for whatever that's worth to you.
So if I have a student pilot seeking private pilot privileges who holds a third-class medical to solo this Cessna 172, how is that student pilot more likely to affect a positive outcome in the event of an in-flight emergency than a student pilot who is seeking sport pilot privileges under Mosaic and can solo this 172 presumably without a medical? Does the holding or not holding of the medical certificate affect the safety of flight in any way? And where's the data to prove that, if that's the case? I'd like to see it.
The only study I could find online that directly addresses this question is this one, published in 2018 by John Mulvey, who is a retired military physician and an instrument-rated commercial pilot. In his study, he determined that medical incapacitation represents either a probable cause or a contributing factor in aviation accidents less than 5% of the time, and that there was no statistical difference between pilots who held a medical and those who did not. This study was not referenced in the Mosaic final rule. So if general aviation pilots aren't dropping like flies midair, what is the real point of the third-class medical process?
The second question I have is having to do with the fact that a sport pilot can only have one passenger in a four-seat airplane. So private pilots flying this airplane or any four-seat airplane can fill it up to its max gross weight. No limitations on flying a 172 with 3 passengers. However, a sport pilot flying the exact same airplane on the exact same trip on the exact same day can only take 1 passenger. Now, is the reason for that because they don't have a medical? And if so, I would like to know, where is the data to show that that requirement is necessary or makes sense? Because I think, let's be honest, logically, it doesn't make any sense at all. The other thing to consider about the passenger carrying limitations is this. Even for private pilots that are legally allowed to carry multiple passengers, as opposed to sport pilots who can only carry 1 passenger, private pilots are not specifically trained to carry more than 1 passenger. The only passenger you technically are required to have during your training, in terms of there being another human in the airplane besides you, is either your instructor or the DPE. Now, could you bring other people along on a training flight if you were flying a 4-seat airplane? Of course. But there's nothing in Part 61 that says a private pilot must be trained for the situation where they are going to carry more than 1 passenger.
And apparently, I'm not the only one who feels this way. In the final rule, the FAA admits that, quote, a large number of commenters to the NPRM recommended allowing additional passengers when operating 4-seat airplanes. In response to these comments, the FAA notes, quote, pilots who possess a higher grade of pilot certificate but are exercising the privileges of a sport pilot certificate do so because they have decided to exercise only the privileges associated with that lower grade of pilot certificate. Often, the pilot cannot meet medical or other minimum airman qualification requirements associated with the higher grade of pilot certificate they currently possess, thereby increasing risk to the general public and the NAS if they were permitted to carry additional passengers. Yet the FAA provides no data to support this statement. Furthermore, FAR 91.107 requires all pilots, sport or private, or higher, to brief their passengers on the use of seatbelts prior to takeoff. And there's nothing in the private or the sport pilot test standards that specifically tests pilots on what to do with their passengers, other than brief them on the use of seatbelts.
So I really don't understand this limitation of sport pilots only being allowed to fly with 1 passenger in a 4-seat airplane, whereas private pilots can carry multiple passengers. I suspect that this has more to do with the insurance requirements than it does with training or medical certification. But again, where is the data?
In the final rule, the FAA notes that it does not regulate based on what third-party insurance companies may require for coverage. I searched the NPRM comments database for anything that may have been submitted by an insurance carrier or underwriter and was unable to find anything. And for what it's worth, this is what Google AI has to say on the matter.
I have had comments on this channel in the past, presumably by sport pilots who appear to believe, based on my content, that I somehow think sport pilots are inadequate or poorly trained. That is absolutely not the case. I don't think that a sport pilot is any less capable of flying my Cessna 172 than a private pilot, if properly trained. And that's the bottom line. Being properly trained and sufficiently trained to handle emergency procedures and crosswinds and all the other things has absolutely nothing to do with holding a medical or not. It has absolutely nothing to do with the minimum requirements being 20 hours for a sport pilot versus 40. It all has to do with the pilot being properly trained. I had a few minutes waiting in the car today, so I thought I would tell you about an interesting situation that came up this week when I had a potential new customer come to the flight school for orientation. And then we get around to talking about the FAA medical. And I always tell all of my customers, doesn't matter age or background or anything, I always say, look, you want to get this done sooner rather than later, because if anything should come up in your medical history that would prevent you from getting a third-class medical, you want to consider moving forward with training, because if you can't ultimately get the medical certificate, you won't be able to solo and earn your private pilot certificate. And I told him, as I tell everybody, some of the most common things that we see these days are ADHD disorders and taking ADHD-related medication. And instantly he looked at me and he said, Meredith, I'm on medication for ADHD. And I said, oh man, I said, well, that's going to be very difficult for you to get a medical now. I said, it's not impossible, but you're looking at a rather long and potentially very expensive process to get cleared to fly, given that you're taking that now. You're probably going to have to get off of it before they'll let you get the medical, at all.
Pilots who disclose on their FAA medical application that they have been diagnosed with ADHD or they're taking medication for ADHD have to go through a fairly lengthy process in order to get approved. Even the quote fast track is fairly extensive. But again, remember, sport pilots don't have to go through this process at all. And if you look at the guidance on the FAA's website on medications, it's pretty vague regarding ADHD medication.
And he said, well, I've been thinking about getting off of it anyway. And I asked him, I said, well, what, if you don't mind my asking, I said, it's none of my business and you can, tell me to pound sand, but if you don't mind my asking, why are you taking it? And he said that it helps him focus at work. I said, okay, do you find that you can function normally without it? And, we didn't get too detailed into his business or his history with that. That's not my position. All I offered to him was, I said, look, if you want to be a pilot, a private pilot, you're going to have to get this medical. And taking that medication, you're not going to be able to get the medical. However, I told him about Mosaic and the sport pilot rule. And I said one thing to consider is that if you can voluntarily get yourself off of the medication, and you can say in good conscience that you are not currently taking that medication, and you are able to function normally, and we determined that you seem perfectly fine and you can operate the airplane just like anybody else, then an option for you would be to proceed with getting a sport pilot certificate. Now, again, I still haven't heard back from the FAA on this whole business of, are we seeking a sport pilot certificate or are we seeking a private pilot certificate? But just, moving forward with the assumption that he would be able to solo my 172 without a medical as a sport pilot student, I offered that to him that could be an option if he can get himself off the medication. So we'll see what happens. But I have a feeling we're going to be seeing more and more of this.
So according to the CDC, 6% of U.S. adults claim to have ADHD, and 1/3 of them are on medication for it. But again, without any concrete data from the FAA on the outcomes of the sport pilot community operating without medicals, it's very difficult to say that holding a medical will prevent someone from having an accident versus a sport pilot operating without one is in danger of having an accident.
This is not a huge problem. People are not crashing airplanes right and left for medical issues. It's almost always pilot error. It's the stall spin accidents. It's, running out of gas, flying into IMC, all the usual things. We are not coming up with any creative ways to kill ourselves in small airplanes. And, despite my concerns a couple years ago about pilots taking the COVID jab and passing out in the cockpit, it's not happening on a regular basis. We're not seeing a huge uptick in pilots dying due to medical incapacitation. Now, with that said, as I'll show you here, I want you to consider the fact that pilots, general aviation pilots like you and me, are not flying every single day. A very active flight instructor might be flying every day. A very active airline pilot might be flying every day. But your average Joe pilot, private pilot, or sport pilot is not flying every day. They'll probably be lucky if they fly once a month. Maybe they fly a couple hours a month. And if you compare that to how many hours the average person, pilot or not, drives their car, it's orders of magnitude more hours that they spend in their car than they spend in an airplane. So what are the odds, just basic statistics, if you're going to have some sort of incapacitating medical event, it's statistically more likely that would happen in your car than in your airplane if you happen to be a pilot. That's just basic math.
I found this study online which concluded that only about 1% of all driving accidents are caused by medical incapacitation. Yet the FAA dismissed the study in the Mosaic final rule, noting that, quote, the safety considerations between cars and aircraft operating at night differ considerably. Okay, that's a fair statement, but again, what does that have to do with the FAA medical certification process? If the FAA is really worried about a pilot's visual acuity while flying at night, why not simply require only a vision test? Why require all the other stuff?
So I'm not quite sure what the FAA is still thinking with saying that, oh, private pilots must have a medical because this is going to somehow keep the sky safer and keep, save them from themselves in the airplane from having some sort of medical event, versus a sport pilot without a medical doing the right thing as we all are supposed to do before every single flight, no matter what kind of medical you have. You're supposed to self assess that you are healthy enough to go fly right now. The fact that Joe Private Pilot got his third class medical 2 years ago or 5 years ago or whenever it was has absolutely nothing to do with the way they feel today. Has nothing to do with the way they feel the moment they get in the airplane and go fly. That's what matters. Everybody knows their own body. Everybody knows their own capabilities. And I just really wish the FAA would finally just admit that the third class medical is totally pointless and just get out of the way and put their money where their mouth is. If they were willing to endorse Mosaic, they should be willing to can the third class medical, period. So, look, the bottom line is regardless of what this potential pilot decides to do, all that matters to me is that he's able to perform. If he chooses to go the sport pilot route and claims that he's not taking the medication, personally, I don't really care whether he is or isn't. I just care about, is he able to function as pilot in command? Does the guy pay attention? Does the guy do the right thing? Does he use his checklist? Does he perform just as well as his peer who went through the hoops of getting a third class medical and is seeking a private pilot certificate? I don't really care. I care about whether or not these pilots are performing and are able to function. And if he is, fantastic. If he isn't, he's not going to get through my hoops. He's not going to be able to solo my airplane. So at the end of the day, the guy's medical status, for me personally, doesn't really make a difference. What matters is the person functional or not? And that's determined by us, the flight instructors, not by the FAA.